researchers supporting the conclusion in the 2010 Arctic Report Card issued by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. The report card tells a story of widespread, continued, and even dramatic effects of a warming Arctic. Lead researcher Jackie Richter-Menge, an expert at the Federal Cold Regions Research and Engineering Lab in Hanover, New Hampshire, told reporters. She says it is increasingly unlikely, at least in the foreseeable future, that we will return to previous Arctic conditions, she said. It is very likely warming will continue in the Arctic, she added, and planning is urgent to adapt to the changes coming. While 2009 saw a slowdown in Arctic warming, the report card stated the first half of 2010 shows a near-record pace with monthly anomalies of over 4 degrees centigrade, 7 degrees Fahrenheit in northern Canada. Past report cards have also cited warming trends. The scientists acknowledge, but this last year has seen several anomalies. Record temperatures in Greenland, the largest recorded loss of ice from a Greenland glacier, a 110 square mile chunk that broke off Peterman Glacier, and a 2009 to 2010 winter that saw a blast of Arctic winds that went north-south instead of west-east, causing a deep freeze across the U.S. Northeast and Midwest. And the last thing I'll tell you, it says here, that latter event, which had been registered only 3 times in 160 years of records, looks like it's connecting to the warming and ice loss in the Arctic, said Jim Overland, a NOAA scientist responsible for the report cards section on atmosphere. He says, normally we think of winds bottled up in the Arctic, he said, but now a north-south shift might become more common. As we lose more sea ice, it's a paradox that warming in the atmosphere can create more of these winter storms, he added. It goes on and on and on.
If that was a grade 12 paper, I would fail it. And I would fire those 2 people because they simply don't know what they're talking about. There are fundamental, basic errors in what they are saying. And of course, part of the difficulty is that so many of these people have come out of a school system and they've come out of environmental studies programs where they've been indoctrinated. It is absolutely incredible. And I mean, I know the Americans have a much greater distrust of government than Canadians do, but I'll tell you, if you ever want a distrust of government, there's a classic example of it. Now, first of all, glaciers are calving off of Greenland and Antarctica all of the time. You remember, noticing that one article you mentioned was about increased snowfall.
Right.
Well, glaciers are formed by increased snowfall. They are created by snowfall. And what happens is enough winter snow survives the summer that you start to get layers of snow forming, and they gradually build up and eventually, through a process called nivation, become ice. And when they get to a certain thickness, the ice becomes plastic and starts to flow. As the glacier then flows out, it breaks off. The Titanic iceberg was exactly that pattern of ice coming off of Greenland. And by the way, you want to go and plot where the Titanic hit the iceberg. It's way south of where you've seen icebergs since that time because there was warming going on. Now there's cooling again. But the other thing that they clearly don't understand is that there's a boundary between the cold polar air and the warmer tropical air called the polar front. And along that polar front in the upper atmosphere blows the jet stream, strong river of air. And it meanders, wanders north and south. It creates waves, and those waves are called Rossby waves. And this is not new scientific information. Rossby waves were identified by Carl Rossby in 1943. The shape of the waves determines the pattern of weather in the middle and high latitudes in both hemispheres. Now, you have periods when the waves are what are called zonal, that is, they're fairly low amplitude, the weather patterns are more predictable, winds are out of the northwest in the winter and the southwest in the summer. But then, as the temperature starts to cool down, the wave pattern changes to what is called meridional flow. That is, the winds become more north and south. And what did the guy say in the article? Oh, more north-south winds. Well, if he knew his climate and he knew his science, he would understand what's causing that. This meridional flow, of course, means that you've got much colder air pushing well south in some areas, as we've got right now. You look at Florida with the record cold temperatures now, but you also, of course, where you've got cold air pushing south, you're going to have warm air pushing north somewhere else. We're in a world in which only the warm air gets reported, and if they mention the cold air, they say, oh, well, that's due to warming. Well, what rubbish is that? Even the public understand the illogic of that kind of statement. So I would give it a failure for grade 10, let alone grade 12.
I just want to finish with this one piece. In Greenland, it says, the warmth has meant accelerated flow of meltwater from glaciers into the ocean, said Jason Box, a glaciologist at Ohio State University. As a result, he added, sea level projections will need to be revised upward. I don't understand any of this, but anyway.
Yeah.
If what you're saying is true, and I accept that it's true from having spent a lot of hours with you and the integrity with which you work and think, but how come all of these supposed professionals are only dealing with little aspects of this? They're not dealing in a whole systems aspect to climate. How can this Jason Box, a glaciologist at Ohio State University, say what he just said?
How did the scientists at the Climatic Research Unit, the leaked emails which showed their degree of duplicity, and of course the sad part is, and I don't know if we talked about this yet, but one of the things I watched over my career in academia was we went from publish or perish to bring in funding or perish. And of course you get funding, and once you get funding, science goes out the window. Because you get the funding to prove something, well, you'll do anything to prove what you got the funding for, even if the evidence shows you the opposite. And the opposite in science is called the null hypothesis. And of course, this is what you see, and I watch with students. They're so imbued with finding positive results that they say, this is what I'm going to pursue. And if they find evidence that contradicts it, they just ignore it. They push it aside. This is what's happening with the mainstream media now. They've got the story in their heads before they go out, and they only talk to people that are going to tell them what they want to hear. Anybody says, well, hang on a minute, oh, they just ignore that, or, oh, they're paid by the oil companies, or they're crackpots, and so on. So the bias, go back to the bias thing again, is just frightening, and it's occurring in the academic world, and there it's even more troubling because supposedly the academic world is beyond that. And by the way, part of it occurred with government cutbacks to universities, and universities discovered that they could simply peel a 35 to 40% off the top of any funding that an academic brought in, and therefore the academics that brought in the more funding were seen as the ones to be promoted and advanced. Of course, we saw this with Penn State, with Michael Mann and the amount of money he was bringing in, and the university whitewashing him. And the same thing has happened at the University of East Anglia, because they were bringing in millions of dollars into the university. It really is really disturbing. And if people say, well, you're generalizing, it's not all academics. Unfortunately, Kim, my view is if there are people that are doing things wrong, if the majority don't speak out about it, then they are accessories after the fact. They are as culpable as the people that are performing the malfeasance. I don't care what group you're talking about. And so if the majority don't act once problems are pointed out to them, then, as I say, they become parties to the deception and the malfeasance in the academic world.
Part of the reluctance that people may have to speaking out about the propaganda of climate change is that if people are not educated as a climatologist like you are, people are told, shut your mouth, you're not an expert, you don't know what you're talking about. Thousands upon thousands of experts already agree that this is happening, and you are completely not in the real world. Or Prince Charles, who I happen to like some of the work that he's doing with the rainforest, also feels that people that are, quote, climate deniers are like flat earthers, which I resented because I'm not a flat earther. I've spent a lot of time on this. But it's a lot of public pressure when you get celebrities and heads of industries and all that. It's like going with the flow just to get along.
There's a couple of things about this. First of all, the Earth is round, but I think I'd prefer a flat Earth, because when we had a flat Earth, you could push the idiots off the edge. Now with the round Earth, they just come right back at you or the other side. But what we're talking about here, of course, is there's a double standard. So, for example, whenever I go on a program, they say, well, how are you qualified? Give us your qualifications. I mean, in a sense, you did it at the introduction of this program. But nobody ever asked Al Gore. They never say, well, Al, what's your qualifications to appear before Senate and talk about climate change? Richard Branson, what's your qualifications?